Hello everyone, I'm Ixalan, and we're continuing with Rivals of Ixalan Full Set Limited Review Week here on my channel. We've covered cards that are white, blue, and black so far in the review. Today we're looking at red. A lot more videos coming even after we get done, giving a grade to every card in the set on Rivals of Ixalan Limited, so don't forget to subscribe to see more of that. I use a letter grade system in these videos, so if you want to know more about how I grade these cards exactly, there is a link in the description below to a video explaining how I grade. Let's go ahead and jump into the very first red card in Rivals of Ixalan, which is Blood Sun. This is 2 generic and 1 red mana for a rare enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield, you get to draw a card, and all lands lose all abilities except mana abilities. This card is a fun little homage to Blood Moon, and it will almost certainly have implications for constructed formats, but it isn't going to be a card you should mainboard in this format. There are not enough lands with activated abilities around to make it worth it. Most of the ones that do exist are the rare or mythic flip lands, and you won't be seeing them that often. It does shut down Evolving Wilds, though, which is pretty amusing, so despite all that, it is an F as a mainboard card, even though it cantrips. It just costs too much to be worth it most of the time. But as a sideboard card against someone who has, let's say, 2 Evolving Wilds and a flip land, it's probably worth bringing in. I'm going to give it a C+, and out of the sideboard. So that's, that's not a terrible grade. Definitely shouldn't take it early, but if you see one like in the latter third of a pack, picking one isn't a bad idea. It may also be worth a bunch of money if it ends up actually being as good and constructed as people think it is anyway. Next, we have Bombard, which for 2 generic and 1 red is a common instant that says, Bombard deals 4 damage to target creature. This is a very efficient removal spell at instant speed. We recently had Electrify, which did the same, but for 4 mana, and it was pretty good. This is strictly better, and I think can probably be called a premium removal spell. I'm going to give it a B-. It is first pickable in weaker packs. Next, we have Brass's Bounty, which for 6 generic and 1 red is a sorcery at rare, and it says for each land you control, create a colorless treasure artifact token, and all of those, of course, can tap and sacrifice themselves to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. I don't really like this card. What do you need this much mana for? I mean, really, this format might be a little slower than its predecessor, but it isn't, man, I really need 14 mana right now, slow. Sure, this card does sort of pay for itself. It's kind of a free card and essentially can filter into 7 mana of any color, but why do you want to do that? Sure, treasures have some synergies here and there, and yes, it can help you get the city's blessing right away. But not enough to warrant playing an overcosted card that really is just spinning your wheels, and if you have 7 lands in play and you don't have the city's blessing, that's already a pretty big surprise. This is an F. You should never play it. It's not meant for limited at all. Next, we have Brazen Freebooter, which for 3 generic and a red is a 3/3 human pirate at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you get to create a colorless treasure artifact token. Red only had 2 cards, at common or uncommon, that made treasure and Ixalan, and they were both pretty bad. This remedies that. A 4 mana 3/3 isn't a great rate, but bringing a treasure with it does make this a solid playable. Treasures give you fixing, potential ramping, and help you ascend if that's what you need to do. This card isn't great, mind you. It just isn't the garbage that Wily Goblin and friends were in Ixalan. It's just a solid C. You'll play one in a lot of red decks, especially if you're splashing something. Next up, we have Buccaneer's Bravado, which for 1 generic and 1 red is a common instant that says choose one, target creature gets +1/+1 and gains first strike until end of turn. The other option is target pirate gets +1/+1 and gains double strike until end of turn. This is a nice combat trick. While I think this format is going to take its foot off the gas a little bit compared to Triple Ixalan, it is still going to be a format dominated by combat, and combat tricks are going to be a big part of that. Boosting both power and toughness and giving first strike would be enough for this to be a solid combat trick, probably something like, I don't know, a C-. But the extra pirate upside is the kind that can just win you the game out of nowhere. This isn't quite skullduggery when it comes to combat tricks, but it isn't that far off. I think it's a C+, though I may be overrating it a bit if it turns out this format is a lot slower than its predecessor. Next, we have Charging Tuskodon, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 4/4 dinosaur at uncommon. It has trample, and it says if Charging Tuskodon would deal combat damage to a player, it deals double that damage to that player instead. A 5 mana 4/4 trample is about what you expected 5 mana. The additional line of text here is nice, but it's not great. Sure, if your opponent ends up completely defenseless against this thing, they're going to die pretty fast. But usually they will just double block him and kill him. He does have the dinosaur creature type and solid stats, so I'm not saying he's bad. Just don't expect this to be smashing your opponent in the face for 8 all the time. Yeah, you can occasionally also, your opponent has to chump block with like a 2/2, and you get to kill it and do 4 to your opponent, and that's going to feel pretty good. But he's just not that big. I mean, it's not that hard to double block and kill this guy. he's not terrible. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying don't overrate him. I'm going to give him a C+. You'll play him in a lot of Dinosaur decks, but you won't go after him early. Next, we have Darins Buccaneer, which for 1 red mana is a 2/2 human pirate at uncommon, and as an additional cost to cast it, you have to reveal a pirate card from your hand or pay an additional 2 mana. This is the pirate part of the cycle of creatures that are super efficient, assuming you can reveal a creature of the same type from your hand, which is reminiscent of an old cycle from Lorwyn, with Silvergill Adept actually being a reprint from that original cycle. This is a 3 mana 2/2 in a deck without enough pirates, and I think that's just unplayable. A 1 mana 2/2 is better, but honestly, it's not that much better. Sure, it is more stats than you usually get for 1 mana, but 2/2s get outclassed quickly. In the late game, this is going to be a pretty useless card. Playing it on turn 1 is good. Playing it any other time is pretty medium. It's just a C, and I think the worst card in this cycle, sadly. It's a card that pirate decks will play, but not one you're going to be excited about. Though as a 1 mana 2/2, it does have a decent shot at constructed. Next, we have Direfleet Daredevil, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/1 human pirate at rare with first strike and an awesome text box that says, when Direfleet Daredevil enters the battlefield, exile target instant or sorcery card from an opponent's graveyard. You may cast that card this turn, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any type to cast that spell. If that card would be put into a graveyard this turn, exile it instead. Well, this is awesome flavor-wise. I mean, they managed to print a card that's a lot like Snapcaster Mage, but be red and still feel red. They did. I've seen a lot of people complaining about this format, like, you know, that it's still going to be so tribal-oriented. There are some really well-designed individual cards in this format, and I don't think that should be overlooked, and this is one of them. It doesn't have flash like Snapcaster Mage, and it only lets you steal your opponent's spells from their graveyard, but that's pretty great for limited, especially when packaged with a 2 mana 2/1 first strike body. Those stats alone, plus being a pirate, would probably be like a C+. This makes it yet another very powerful 2-drop rare in the format, as it is good at all stages of the game. In the early game, you can play it as a 2-drop, though, let's be honest, we're all going to be greedy and want to play it in the later game, right, when we can cast a spell. And in that late game situation, you can cast it and fire off one of your opponent's removal spells at one of their creatures. This is going to generate a 2-for-1 a lot of the time in the late game, and that's just great. You'd have to temper your expectations a little bit, because sometimes your opponent just won't play instants and sorceries before you have to cast this, but you will get to cast an opponent's removal spell from their graveyard often enough that this is still pretty great. I think it's a straight-up B+, a card that you first pick over, 95% of the cards in this set. Next, we have Ixalan, Primal Storm, which is 4 generic and 2 red for a 6/6 legendary Elder Dinosaur at rare. So it's the red card in that cycle. And it also has an awesome text box. When it attacks, exile the top card of each player's library. Then you may cast any number of non-land cards exiled this way without paying their mana costs. First of all, that's ridiculous in EDH. Not what we're talking about here, but can't help but think about how ridiculous it is in EDH, but it's also ridiculous in Limited. A 6 mana 6/6, it lets you cast things off not only your own library, but your opponent's each time it attacks is insane. This is an absolute bomb, and if allowed to swing even once, will probably just win you the game because of the massive amount of card advantage and value it's going to give you. It's just an A. You first pick this over 99% of the cards in the format. Maybe it's the best rare. I don't know. I think it and Tetsamok are both incredibly good. I don't know which I like more at this point. I'll have to figure that out when I talk about the best bombs in the format later this week, but they're close. Since Tetsamok does something immediately when it enters the battlefield, it has a little bit of a leg up in some ways over Ixalan, but what Ixalan does over the long game is a lot better. Anyway, let's move on to the next card, which is Fanatical Firebrand, which is 1 red mana for a 1/1 Goblin Pirate at common with haste, and you can tap it and sacrifice it to do 1 damage to target creature or player. This card is a fun callback to Mogg Fanatic, which was a pretty great card in its day. Of course, that was in a world where combat damage could be put on the stack before other effects, and so Mogg Fanatic could use the damage it did in combat and the damage from its effect to take down creatures with 2 toughness. Still, this thing is an early hasty attacker who can do some damage, and in the late game it can help you kill a creature or, do 1 last damage to your opponent. It will be annoying in combat for your opponents as they have to sort of calculate what might happen to their creatures. There will be situations where blocks were profitable, where that is no longer true thanks to the Firebrand. It also carries the useful pirate creature type. All that said, this card isn't anything more than the kind of pirate that you feel fine about having in your deck. It's just a solid C. You'll play it, but it isn't going to be game-changing or anything. Next, we have Forerunner of the Empire, which for 3 generic and a red is a 1/3 human soldier at uncommon. And like all the Forerunners, when it enters the battlefield, it lets you search for a creature of a certain type, in this case Dinosaur, and put it on top of your library. And it has the additional line of text. Whenever a Dinosaur enters the battlefield under your control, you may have Forerunner of the Empire deal 1 damage to each creature. I don't like this one quite as much as I like the others. That's partly because, like, on its own, its stats are horrendous. 4 mana for a 1/3. Yes, it does find you a Dinosaur, and can even let you do 1 damage to the whole board when you play a Dinosaur, which in an ideal world triggers some of your guys with Enrage while killing one of your opponent's creatures or something. Problem is that ideal world won't always exist, so doing 1 to everything frequently won't have any major impact. In fact, if your opponent has guys with Enrage, you just don't want to do it. That's why they made it a May effect, which is a good thing they did, otherwise it would be worse. Still, this is a good card. I don't mean to say it isn't, just that it doesn't impress me as much as the others. I'm hoping I'm wrong, and Enrage is more of a thing in this format instead of the disappointment it was in Triple Ixalan, but I'm going to start this at C+, in a Dinosaur deck. Obviously it's an F if you don't have enough Dinosaurs. Next, we have Form of the Dinosaurs. For 4 generic and 2 red is a rare enchantment that says, when it enters the battlefield, your life total becomes 15, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, Form of the Dinosaur deals 15 damage to target creature an opponent controls, and that creature deals damage equal to its power to you. Every set has a few cards that are so weird and original that it is difficult to evaluate them without playing with them. And yes, I realize this card is a callback to Form of the Dragon, but it's a considerably different card since it doesn't stop your opponents attacking you, and it doesn't continually reset your life the way Form of the Dragon does. You only get it reset once. But this is one of those cards where it's hard to say how good it will be. Putting your life to 15 when you're below 15 is nice, and being able to punch one of your opponent's creatures every upkeep seems good too. I think in most scenarios, this card is good, helping you clear your opponent's guys out of the way for free every upkeep. But what worries me about this card is it isn't a May clause. You have to punch one of your opponent's creatures every upkeep, even if their one creature in play will kill you when you punch it. I think most of the time, that won't come up, and you'll be just killing 2/2s and 3/3s with it and winning the game before it matters. But this isn't the kind of card that just means you win the game because of all the value it gives you. It can legitimately cause your downfall if your opponent plays into it right. All that said, I think I'm going to start it at B-. This is going to be like a 3-for-1 most of the time, and I think that'll win the game quickly enough that you're not going to die to having to fight with your opponent's creatures every turn. But it could be wrong. This one's just a weird card. That's where I'm starting it. I'm looking forward to playing it and feeling out how good it is myself. Next, we have Frilled Death Spitter, which is 2 generic and a red for a 3/2 Dinosaur at common, and it has Enrage, and when it gets Enraged, it deals 2 damage to an opponent. I don't really know why they bothered with this card. We already had 2 similar cards in Ixalan, the 3 mana 3/2 who gains 2 life with Enrage, and the 6 mana 5/4 who did 2 when Enraged. I would have liked to see them use the common slot for something more original here. Neither of those cards were anything special, and this isn't either. It's just a C. You'll play it in aggressive red decks and especially in Dinosaur decks, but there are plenty of 3-drops you'd rather have. Next, we have Goblin Trailblazer, which is 1 generic and a red for a 2/1 Goblin Pirate at common with Menace. It's a nice 2-drop. Early Menace creatures can usually get a couple of swings in before the opponent can even block them, and if you back them up with instant speed removal or bounce and combat tricks, they can be a real problem. He's also a pirate, and that certainly doesn't hurt, but he's just another solid C. 2-drop you'll play, but not one you're excited about. Next, we have Mutiny, which is 1 red mana for a common sorcery, and it says target creature an opponent controls deals damage equal to its power to another target creature that player controls. I want to like this card. I mean, it's a 1 mana removal spell, but we've seen cards like it before, and they almost always underperform. This is because this card is good under conditions that you don't have control over. First, your opponent needs to have 2 creatures in play, and second, you need to them to have stats that allow one of them to kill the other, and this isn't always a given. Third, you are usually going to be killing a mediocre creature with this anyway, since you need your opponent's larger creature, or at least one about the same size, to take down the other one. With all that said, I don't think it's terrible. I just know a lot of people will see it and think of it as an excellent common since it's a 1 mana removal spell. I don't think that's what it is. It's a fine common, one you basically never want to play more than one of, which is basically the classic definition of a C. Next, we have Needletooth Raptor, which for 3 generic and a red is a 2/2 Dinosaur at uncommon, and it has Enrage. When it gets Enraged, it deals 5 damage to a creature an opponent controls. Obviously, a 4 mana 2/2 is bad, but the Enrage trigger on this one is one of the best ones around, essentially killing a creature. On its own, it can theoretically take down a 7/7, and there aren't a ton of situations that feel good for your opponent that involve getting rid of the Raptor. Straight-up kill spells can do it, but they're usually going to be spending at least as much mana as you did to kill this without Enrage triggering going off. it makes the board very awkward for your opponent, who really need to tiptoe around those needle teeth, or things can get ugly. There are also a few ways to trigger Enrage on your guys at will, like the red Forerunner that we saw earlier, and that will just be silly. I'm a little leery of going too high on this card, as it isn't the kind of creature who will actually be great at like attacking, but I'm going to give it a C+. Next, we have a Razka Raptor, which is 2 generic and 2 red for a 3/4 dinosaur at common, and that's it. It's a vanilla dinosaur with decent stats. It's a D+. You'll play it if you need more dinosaurs or 4-drops, but most of the time, you'll cut it. Next, we have Pirate's Pillage, which for 3 generic and 1 red is an uncommon sorcery, and it says as an additional cost to cast it, discard a card, and then you get to draw 2 cards and create 2 colorless treasure artifact tokens. This is basically Tormenting Voice. I mean, in the end, it costs 2 mana thanks to the 2 treasures it gives you, and it lets you discard something to draw 2. The format isn't heavy on discard or graveyard synergy, so that doesn't make this all that appealing. You'll run it if you're a more controlling red deck, or if you're trying to splash some crazy bombs because it gives you treasure, or if you really got there on wanting to have treasure for other reasons. But most of the time, I don't think you want to run this. I'm going to give it a D+. Next, we have Reckless Rage, which is 1 red mana for an uncommon instant, and it says, Reckless Rage deals 4 damage to target creature you don't control. Doesn't end there, though. That would be awesome, right? And 2 damage to target creature you control. This is a very cool card. Another instance of a really unique and interestingly designed card. Obviously, 1 mana to do 4 to one of your opponent's creatures is insane, but you also have to do 2 damage to one of your creatures. Ideally, when you do this, you aren't actually killing one of your creatures, so your deck has to have a lot of X3s in it for this to work. What's more is, it works super well with creatures with Enrage, as you can get a free Enrage trigger on top of killing one of your opponent's creatures for a single mana. It is also instant speed, so sometimes just firing off Reckless Rage to kill one of their guys and damage one of your creatures who's about to die anyway from the removal targeting it is fine too. It has a lot going for it, but it asks for a certain amount of things to be going on your side of the board to be worth it. When you get there, it's going to be a good removal spell. When you don't, you will be 2-for-1ing yourself. I really want to go B- on this thing, but I think I'm going to have to knock it down to C+ because of all the setup. Next, we have Rekindling Phoenix, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 4/3 Phoenix at Mythic Rare and has flying. And it says when it dies, create a 0/1 red elemental creature token with, at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice this creature and return target card named Rekindling Phoenix from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste until end of turn. This card's ridiculous. Giving you great stats already as a 4-mana 4/3 flyer is enough for like a B-, but this comes with massive upside. It can come back and attack every turn after it dies because it gains haste when it comes back, unless your opponent kills the 0/1 elemental before your upkeep. The ideal scenario is getting to constantly bring this Phoenix back and quickly kill your opponents in the air, but even in a worst case scenario, right, where they use a removal spell to kill the Phoenix right away and do something else to kill the 0/1, you're still getting a 2-for-1, and that's the worst case scenario. This Phoenix is good attacking or blocking, as it can do both of those things indefinitely, and it's just a complete bomb. It gets an A. Not many packs where you should be passing this. Next, we have Sea Red, which for 1 generic and 1 red mana is an uncommon enchantment, an aura with enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature gets +2/+1 and has first strike. At the beginning of your end step, if you didn't attack with a creature this turn, sacrifice Sea Red. So there's sort of a mini cycle. It's more of a pair of cards. There's the blue card that's sort of like Curiosity, and Sea Red. Both are relatively powerful auras that require you to attack with the a creature every turn or you lose them. They're sort of there to make it even clearer that raid is what you want to be doing with those two, with that color pair. And this is another aggressive aura for the format and gives a formidable stats boost for very little investment. A creature you just gave +2/+1 and first strike to isn't going to be easy to block. It does have that downside of you have to attack with something every turn, but that's not a real downside in an aggressive deck, especially if you just put Sea Red on one of your creatures. I think auras are going to be a little worse in this format where there's more efficient removal around, but this is still going to win a lot of games for red aggro decks when the opponent just can't deal with the creature after it gets this stat boosts. I'm going to give it a C because of the usual aura downside of potentially getting 2-for-1 and blown out, but this could be a key card in aggressive decks in this format, like Swashbuckling in Ixalan. Next, we have Shake the Foundations, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon, instant, and it says Shake the Foundations deals 1 damage to each creature without flying, draw a card. At instant speed way to do 1 damage to all non-flyers isn't something you see every day, and it comes with a cantrip here. In most formats, this would probably be a sideboard card, but because of Enrage, you can feel okay about mainboarding this in decks that have lots of creatures with Enrage. Enrage is also a downside of this card, though, as you could accidentally trigger your opponent's Enrage with it. I think it's like a D as a main board card and a C out of the sideboard where you can really bring it in and do some damage against decks with lots of X1s. Next, we have Shatter, which for 1 generic and 1 red is a common instant that says, destroy target artifact. This is another card we've seen reprinted 1,000 times. In some formats, it's a serviceable sideboard card. Not so much in this one. There aren't a lot of artifacts worth destroying in this format. There is the rare, the Immortal Sun, which, sure, then you want to bring Shatter in because that card's crazy, and a few of the vehicles from Ixalan that are good. But you should never mainboard this. There aren't enough targets for it, and you'll almost never sight it in either, so I'm giving it a mainboard grade of an F and a sideboard grade of a D. Next, we have Silverclad Ferocidons, which for 5 generic and 2 red is an 8/5 rare dinosaur with Enrage, and when it gets enraged, each opponent sacrifices a permanent. This card does a good job of getting you your money's worth for 7 mana. 8/5 is obviously not the greatest stats package, but it will almost always be a 2-for-1 for your opponent, and like a lot of enraged creatures with powerful enrage abilities, it is a real pain to either have to block or attack through, as your opponent will just start hemorrhaging permanents in most situations. Still, this costs 7, so I can't get too excited about it. I do think Ramp is going to be better in this format than it was in the last one, but not enough better to make a card like this a legit first pickable bomb or something. I think even in a format with really good Ramp, this isn't quite a bomb. I'm actually just going to start it at C+, though I hope I am wrong, and this format is so much slower that maybe this moves into the B range. Next, we have Stampeding Horncrest, which for 4 generic and a red is a 4/4 dinosaur at common, and it has haste as long as you control another dinosaur. A 5-mana 4/4 that only has haste sometimes doesn't interest me a whole lot. Even if it had haste all the time, like, it wouldn't be higher than a C+. It may only even be a C. This just doesn't do enough for the mana, and isn't the kind of dinosaur payoff you're really going to be looking for to make your dinosaur deck come together. It's a C-. You'll play it, but you'll probably cut it an equal amount of the time. Next, we have Stormfleet Swashbuckler, which for 1 generic and 1 red is an uncommon human pirate with Ascend, and it has double strike as long as you have the city's blessing. This is the kind of Ascend card that I think is good. Even if you never get the blessing of the city, this provides you with a 2-mana 2/2 with the useful pirate creature type. If you ever get the blessing, he does become a formidable attacker and blocker thanks to double strike, especially in a world with combat tricks and auras. Don't get me wrong, he's nothing incredible. I'm just pointing out that the cards with Ascend that are playable, even without the blessing, are the ones that are worth playing most of the time. In this case, this guy becomes relevant at multiple stages of the game thanks to the blessing. I think he's still just a C+. You'll be pretty happy with him as your 2-drop in your pirate decks, but probably not overjoyed. Next, we have Sun-Collared Raptor, which for 1 generic and 1 red is a 1/2 dinosaur at common, and it has Trample, and you can pay 2 generic into red for Sun-Collared Raptor to get +3, +0 until end of turn. So, if you've been watching my content a long time, you've seen me, get on my soapbox about this kind of card. And I apologize if you've heard this rant before, because we're about to have it again. If you haven't, well, maybe this will be enlightening for you. These cards aren't good. Other recent examples of them are Bellows Lizard and Ember Eye Wolf. I hate these cards in part because they fool a lot of people into thinking they're good. They're definitely not, and I'll explain why. They just don't end up working out well when you look at the amount of mana you have to dump into them. This thing can't even trade with a 2 toughness creature unless you give it 3 additional mana. And that means you have to pay 5 total mana to kill a 2 toughness creature. And the mana keeps going up as the opponent's toughness gets higher. In this case, the power boost is significant enough that at least, you can probably kill a 3 or 4 drop with it too. But even then, you're spending a total of 5 mana to kill a 2, 3, or 4 drop. So you're actually coming out behind mana-wise. No matter what happens, you're going to come out behind mana-wise. And that's not good. In a way, Sun-Collared Raptor, if you're attacking with it and your opponent just blocks with a 2/2, that's a horrible scenario. You end up having to pay 3 mana. Yeah, you get to do a little bit of trample damage in this case, but you're basically time-walking yourself just to kill a 2/2. And your Raptor still dies. It doesn't pump its own toughness at all. This does come with trample, so at least if you pump a ton of mana into it, it can do some damage to your opponent, and it has a useful creature type too, and those things do keep this from just being an F, which is what I give a lot of these cards. But I would run pretty much every other red 2-drop in the format before I would run this. I'm giving it a D. Don't, think of the ideal situation where you play this guy and your opponent's board's completely empty and it just runs them over, or where the only creature they have is a 2/2 blocker and you're going to win no matter what. That's not going to happen very often. What's more frequently going to happen, people play 2-drops all the time in Limited, and you play this as your 2-drop, and your opponent plays like a 2-mana 2/2, and then you're pretty much you pretty much lose at that point. You're going to lose a lot of tempo just to trade with that thing, and that's not what you want to do. So it's a D. Avoid it most of the time. It does handle, auras and equipment. Putting those on them does make it a little better, but it's still bad. Don't play it, 95% of the time. Next, we have Swaggering Corsair, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/2 human pirate at common with raid, and that means when it attacked, if you attacked with something, you get an extra effect. In this case, it comes into play with a +1/+1 counter. If this format is anything like Triple Ixalan, this is going to be a 3-mana 3/3 a lot of the time. Most decks run lots of 2-drops that are getting in there early, and this gives you a nice little raid trigger that gives red an uncharacteristically efficient 3-mana 3/3, not to mention the fact that it's a pirate. That said, it can definitely end up being a 3-mana 2/2 a decent chunk of the time, and that's bad. I'm just going to start it at C, but wouldn't be too shocked to see it move up if you're just like always playing it as a 3/3. Next, we have Tilonalli's Crown, which for 1 generic and 1 red is an enchantment and aura at common with enchant creature, and when it enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to the creature it's enchanting, and that creature gets +3/+0 and has trample. This is an interesting aura, and yet again, another interestingly designed card, as it can do a range of things. You can put it on your opponent's X1 creature, or a creature that needs 1 more damage to die to use it as a removal spell. You can also put it on your own creature, especially one with Enrage, and get a nice Enrage trigger while increasing its stats. While I think this is interesting, I don't think it's very good, mostly because the stats boost it grants isn't super desirable. You generally want to be increasing a creature's toughness, or at least providing an ability that makes it harder to block, like First Strike, but this doesn't do that. It gives you trample, which is sort of evasive in that you're going to get in for some damage no matter what, but it isn't going to make your creature who couldn't attack into a creature who can attack super profitably. It might make it so your creature can attack on a board, but your opponent will likely kill it in combat and you end up getting 2 for 1. Now, if you go super aggro and put this on a 1 or 2 drop, like on turn 2, some interesting things might happen, but that's not going to happen often enough. I'm going to start this at D-. I don't see myself playing it very often. Next up, we have Tilonalli's Summoner, which for 1 generic and 1 red is a 1/1 human shaman at rare with Ascend, and it says whenever it attacks, you may pay X and a red. If you do, create X 1/1 red elemental creature tokens that are tapped and attacking. At the beginning of the next instep, exile those tokens unless you have the City's Blessing. This card's great. Why? Well, because if you don't have the City's Blessing when you cast it, it can generate its own City's Blessing pretty easily. Say you make 4 elementals. Chances are you have 10 permanents, and those elementals are going to stick around. Sure, the summoner will die in combat. There's no way it's going to survive unless your opponent's insane. But if you're allowed to untap and attack with this, you're going to have an awful lot of elementals sticking around after combat. I'm going to give this a B. I think it's first pickable much of the time. Well, that's the last red card. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this limited review, don't forget to subscribe. And tomorrow I'll be back with all of the green cards in Rivals of Ixalan. Thanks for watching.